All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials World podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking right. It's currently 2025, of course. Many people have said this is a horrible year, maybe even a horror movie-esque year. We have things like JD Vance being really cool and awesome, and, Trump just
And
having a
looking
huge
really
dick and just
hot.
getting everything
And looking
done.
really
Yeah.
hot.
Oh, for sure. And definitely not having any physical ailments. His hand looks totally normal. His tan is totally natural and not spray.
Yeah, did he
But
get like a thinner curse, but it's like purpler? Did he get like cursed by a gypsy?
yeah, he got purpler. It was fucking Grimace that did it to him.
He's turning into Grimace?
He's always been Grimace, at least since he became president. Let's be honest here. I mean,
Body
he loves
shape, body
McDonald's,
form. Oh, that's true. They really got to
but
get on that.
no, absolutely. But you know what? A thing that might elevate this horror even more so, and not, elevated horror in the way that, those stupid fucking slasher movies from the old days that were made for idiots and dummies, that type of bullshit, right?
Elevated horror like the film Devil.
Yes, or like Pieces, the Juan Picure Simone movie, a very notable elevated horror movie that is very well regarded by critics.
Very artsy, a little too artsy for me. Makes me kind of feel a little woo watching it, if you know what I mean.
No, exactly. But speaking of elevated and artsy horror, that's going to be our subject for this week. So let's get into our subject once again. It's elevated/art horror. But before we get into our subject this week, Brian, let's bring
What?
back our segment,
Oh,
Cringe Generational Cringe Millennium Moment of the Week.
weak, 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 weak.
Woo! Yeah! All right. And Brian, talk about elevated horror, right? I want to talk about something that is a genuinely horrible and horrifying story to all of us online people, and especially online millennials. Brian, and I know this one really bummed you out, but I want to talk about King Cobra JFS and his very recent passing, because it bummed you out and it bummed me out too, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so we'll do a little bit of background around King Cobra JFS. Not like a scholar of him the way that I am of maybe some other lolcows and some other internet lore. Josh was his first name. He died last week, a few days ago, fairly suddenly, but he was a lolcow. I don't know if I need to, do we need to explain what a lolcow is? Like in the context of our show, I feel like it's pretty.
A lolcow is essentially somebody on the internet who just always engaged with trolls and drama and online BS in a way that was always unhealthy. Literally always unhealthy.
Counterproductive,
No
and like they can't
lolcow has
stop.
ever looked good. They've never looked good after engaging with the online torment. It's literally never worked.
So I do watch like shitty internet drama, lol cow, but I don't take part in any sort of like I'm in my 30s now. It's that time is well past me. I don't take part in any sort of trolling or any joke. I haven't even been adjacent to that in probably like 15 years, right? But I watch videos and retrospectives. And this guy, King Cobra, the way he always struck me, and I think this is the impression I got even, before his passing, his untimely passing from most of his audience, right? He never really did anything horrible. I don't want to say he was like a great guy. He just seemed like he drank a lot and he ate gross food and he made pretty poor life choices. But the general vibe from his, I don't know if you want to say his fans, right, was that he was this awkward, pretty sure diagnosed autistic guy, not very well socialized, who kind of just did his own thing. And there was this general feeling, even though people mocked him, and maybe this is a little bit of cap because of guilt because of his death, but I think some of it's genuine that like, oh, this is a guy, who needs to stop drinking and fucking take better care of himself. Otherwise, like, not like you're I don't know, like your Dan Larson or your Chris Chance or whoever. There's issues with the trolling of those individuals as well. Like, to be clear, like whatever they've done. But there was no sexual impropriety. He never said anything shitty. I think he wasn't a bigot or anything like that. He's just kind of a gross guy that didn't take good care of himself and drank an insane amount. But he loved like metal. And he actually made some metal music, lo-fi metal music, even though he couldn't play any instruments or sing. But he loved Ozzy Osbourne and Cradle of Filth. He loved Doc Holliday, the character from Tombstone that Val Kilmer played, right? And because of that, he wore like a cowboy hat to like conceal his bald head, his bald spot. And he kind of had a little bit of some weirdo like swag to him. He had kind of a little bit of drip, to be honest. this is going to sound so funny, Taylor. It's so funny to say. He hated pedophiles. He hated pedophiles. He hated rapists. He hated women beaters. He called them all sickos. And I think that's your proof that this is like genuine. This isn't like the YouTube guys that like are clearly weird that want to bully someone smaller so they do their YouTube. He would talk at length about sickos and how if I had a girl, I'd never be like a sicko, because I can't imagine at one point a girlfriend, but we're not going to talk about her for various reasons. But this guy died, what is it, a week and a half now?
Yeah, but a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. It's pretty recent. And as of recording this, we're going to release this like a month from now, but it was pretty recent
34,
as of recording.
34 years old. So he's about my age. He's just slightly older than me. He had made some posts on Facebook. That's where, he'd make his content, which was what he called food hacks. He'd invent drinks, or he'd invent meals, which is just him mashing food and beverages together that didn't belong together.
Honestly, though, Brian, his culinary expertise is legendary online. Like, the fact that he didn't die from cooking and, like, making his drinks before is actually kind of impressive, because, like, there's literally videos of him about to burn down his apartment from
incredible.
Him being such a dog shit cook. It's wild.
No, this guy is a true original. He truly was. I don't know how else to say this. He was funny. It was funny to watch. But he starts posting on Facebook that he's having some extreme stomach pains, right? He stops posting it. And I guess about a day or two later, his dad goes to his apartment to check on him, and he's dead. I don't think they've released cause of death yet. I don't really think they need to. Two leading theories, I would say. There are people saying liver failure. He drank a crazy amount. And apparently he only started drinking when he was like in his mid-20s. I'm leaning more towards an appendicitis myself. Just because the idea of someone at his age, even as an alcoholic, drinking their liver into remission like that is crazy to me.
To have like a decade of drinking and dying from it like that is pretty wild. Like, I'm not going to say that's impossible, but that would take a lot of dedication, like gallons of alcohol a day, basically, to do that.
At that point, he would have to be drinking beyond the point of it having any sort of benefit, to where that was like just constant, right? And it had to be hard. It would have to be just like hard liquor down the hatch all the time. I'm leaning towards an appendicitis, but that's neither here nor there. I guess the thing with Josh, and like, Taylor and I think we both grew up consuming local content. We both came up on, probably some kind of sketchy corners of the internet in retrospect. We are old millennials and we grew up on a different time of the internet. But I think looking back at this guy, he is very much a millennial, right? He was this weird guy who was kind of in an arrested adolescence, but not really a guy that ever hurt anyone. Really, he primarily seemed like he hurt himself. So in that way, he's like the best lolcow, right?
I mean, there are definitely some other lolcows that I can think of who are like, and to be fair, almost all lolcows are like on the spectrum or have some sort of developmental or like learning disability.
Right, there's
like,
issues with mocking these people. Yeah.
Like literally pretty much all of them. But I think there's some others who are like just anime losers or something, like giant weebs who didn't hurt anybody too. But yeah, definitely King Cobra JFS is definitely one of the least harmful, I would say, by a lot. Because yeah, you're right. He mostly hurt himself. He did have his like fail orbiters in his like random Wyoming town, or I think it was actually Casper, which I think is capital of Wyoming. So by Wyoming standards, that's like the metropolis. As somebody who's been within a few hours of that city, that area does not have a whole lot going on, I'll be honest with you. As somebody who is within about 2 hours of where he lived, there's nothing really going on there, to be honest.
One of the things with the lolcow thing, and again, I'm not judging anyone for laughing at weird people online. I do believe that's, if you are engaging and you're making content online, you're putting yourself out there. It is similar to making art. It's similar to anytime you put yourself out there. Like, there is a level of criticism you're going to get, but there's even a level of mockery that I think you should expect. And there's like, there's levels to it, and there's a point where it kind of becomes something inappropriate, but I'm not passing judgment on anyone for laughing at like weirdos online. I've said several times on here, and I will probably bring it up in the future, like being on the message board, the Something Awful message boards was like a formative thing for me in my adolescence. So I can't like say there's never any value to these like trollish communities. But one of the things that's always struck me a little raw, even at my worst and at my youngest, is I remember I'd be reading the Quickie. That's the Chris Chan Encyclopedia. This is before the Geno Samuel documentary. This is kind of before lolcows as a thing. And a thing that always bothered me is you'd have these guys on there who would be like kind of couching their reasons for trolling Chris as like, well, he's racist and he's sexist and he's homophobic and like he thinks women are sex objects. And I really like it's funny. Like I love laughing about some of the weird stuff that Chris did, but it's like let's not pretend that you care about that. Like these guys from Something Awful in 4chan in like the late 2000s. Like, come on, you know?
Yeah, I mean, well, especially in 4chan's case, you were literally on the forum that like had like explicit child sex abuse material and like murders on it. Like,
And
don't
Nazi
pretend
shit.
you're above that and Nazi shit. So don't pretend you are above fucking Chris Chan just because like he's slightly more autistic than you guys are. Like, fuck off. Who cares?
Yeah.
And granted, obviously, I love laughing at Chris Chan too, but I'm not gonna pretend like I'm above the fucking just laughing at the circus freak show. That's what the
Like,
fuck I'm doing.
and
Like, seriously.
And us laughing at that, I have no illusion about this. That is like a symptom of like a failure of like the internet and of like American society. Not just their existence in the way like Chris Chan's existence in the life that they lead, but all of us consuming it. That is symptomatic of a failure of our society.
No, it is 100%. But you know what, Brian? You know what else is a failure of our society? Is the fact that snooty fucking critics can talk shit about my favorite genre while not actually liking the genre. Does that piss you off?
It's not just that they can talk shit about it. It's that they have no desire to engage with it on its own terms. They know what they think of it, and they have sort of a class system of like genres of films. I am, of course, talking about my favorite genre, hardcore pornography.
Yes, 100%. Brian is a huge golden age of porn enjoyer, but he also enjoys the gonzo era that we've been in since the 2000s. But no, this week, of course, we're going to be talking about elevated/art horror. Now, I hate this term elevated horror. I think it's stupid. I think it's dismissive towards movies and the like film industry in itself. And it's one of those things, right, where like, and to be fair, I actually do like the vast majority of films that people consider quote unquote elevated horror. I think there's a lot of like value and artistic utility in them. But also I feel that way about fucking Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street and the Saw movies and stuff like that. And to be honest with you, it's one of those things where those movies have a lot of artistic merit and, you know, commercial merit, obviously. And we're obviously going to be going into this topic that we're going to be doing this week. But I did want to highlight some films that people do consider to be elevated horror, right? So this term kind of came into parlance, I would say, around like 15-ish years ago, I want to say, to try to differentiate itself once again from your Friday the 13th, your Nightmare on Elm Street, and your Saw movies and stuff like that. So you have movies like The Babadook, which I think was probably the first movie to be explicitly called elevated horror in the modern context. If I'm not mistaken, would you say that's a realistic statement, Brian?
I think that was. If that wasn't the start of the term, maybe within critical circles, that's definitely... So The Babadook is like the mold for what we now call elevated horror. And Taylor, as you said, it's dismissive towards the wider genre. It's also kind of stupid because like there's always been, right, horror films that are horrifying, that have a higher artistic pretense, right? Whether that's Suspiria or Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. The thing with elevated horror as it developed in the 2010s is that is explicit and you're meant to be aware of it while you're watching it. And I'm not saying that necessarily makes it bad, but I think there's a very conscious thing when you watch a movie like The Babadook. You're supposed to be thinking when watching it, oh, this is a very serious, like a very good horror movie. And I like The Babadook, but that is like the beginning of where we see a lot of these tropes kind of develop. And like you said, a lot of it's very, very good. Some of the most well-crafted cinema overall, I think, of the 2010s. But the term itself, pretty loaded. And there's a lot of things that you see even in The Babadook, right? It's this focus on kind of not downplaying, but kind of like the slow burn. It's the monster as trauma, which I gotta say is one of my least favorite fucking trope in horror right now. You see elevated horror, become crystallized as a specific thing. And I gotta say, probably starts with The Babadook in the mainstream.
Yes, and talk about obviously the monster as trauma thing. People say elevated horror, but the vast majority of these stories are literally just monster as trauma. How can you have an elevated genre and it basically only deals with like one or two thematic themes? Like, that's crazy to me.
Well, so like I said, I liked The Babadook. I've seen it 3 times now in my life. But my issue with the monster as trauma bit is that it lays all the cards on the table. Not necessarily when The Babadook does it, because it really earns it. It really takes its time. It really gets you in the heads of that family, the mother and child in it. But to me, when you see, especially after the Babadook, a lot of the horror is coming from your trauma or your own mental illness. It's kind of like almost looking at the audience and saying, see, this wasn't really a horror movie. This is a psychodrama. You thought this was a movie that was supposed to scare you? No, it's supposed to make you think and feel emotions.
No, exactly. And, of course, we just talked about the Babadook. So, in general, I think there is, at least in the modern context, a sort of maybe big four of, like, quote unquote, elevated horror filmmakers. And I would say those would be people like Jordan Peele and Ari Aster, and Robert Eggers is also great. You've seen his movies,
yes,
right?
I've seen The Witch, seen The Lighthouse. Really like The Lighthouse. Gotta say, my favorite Eggers movie is not his horror films. It's The Northman. Fantastic.
Yep, The Northman is absolutely fucking fantastic. I loved that movie quite a bit.
I think Eggers and Aster, right, are the two probably that encapsulate the best of elevated horror, I would say.
Yes, 100%. I would say quite a bit, because they are filmmakers who have made actually pretty scary movies, and they also have that critical acclaim angle to them, right? I don't think there's been a single movie of theirs that I can think of that got negative reviews, that at least that I can think of. Certainly, I'm sorry, you said Ari Aster and Robert Eggers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I know a lot of people had issues with the thematic, I guess, backdrop of There's Something Strange About the Johnsons, which I don't personally. I think it's perfectly fine. But that's the most criticism I can think of with Ari Aster, really, outside of the, bet his fucking parents' therapy bills were crazy. It's no, come on. It's the same one where it's you got to be high or drunk to enjoy this. It's it's not really a criticism. It's a total boomer joke.
Yeah, it's just you saying, I don't know how to watch a movie. I don't know how to think about a movie while I watch it. I think with both Eggers and Aster, this kind of leads into why the term elevated horror can be loaded, and why you'll sometimes see it. You'll see people use it as a criticism, and I've done that myself in the past. You'll also see people say that they like elevated horror kind of as a signal that they don't like, low horror. But the thing with both Eggers and Aster, and I think other people who've worked in this milieu well, is there is an understanding of the history of horror and of the genre. Robert Eggers, a lot of the way that his films are composed, the way that they're shot, the performances in them, it's coming more from kind of naturalistic, pre-code horror sensibility, right? In the case of Aster, I think there is a lot of there's stuff that he's learned from 70s exploitation, right? There's things in Hereditary, there's things in Midsummer that are pretty shocking, pretty salacious in their way, in their portrayals of, violent acts or horrifying acts. There's an understanding and appreciation for the horror genre beyond I'm going to make a serious big boy movie. It's going to be scary.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Especially Ari Aster and Robert Eggers, of course, too. They have that understanding of things that are actually scary. And also, especially Eggers, he is so good at portraying the time and frame of all of his period pieces and giving them the values that they would have at that point in time. Especially in The Northman and The Witch, those movies can be kind of jarring to watch until you realize oh no, those are the values that people in 1600s Pilgrim America and 1100s Norway and Sweden and Iceland would have. Those are the values that they would have. Those are the things that they would aspire to, and the mythologies that they would have, right? And I think that adds a lot of things. And also, of course, Nosferatu was his most recent movie, and they definitely delved into that quite a bit as well.
And now, it's also that his films don't moralize about that.
They don't moralize at all. And also, the other one, in what my opinion I think is the top four, and this is a very recent one, but his movies have just been so good recently. And of course, I've always been a fan of his sketch comedy show with Trevor Moore, rest in peace. But Zach Cregger is definitely coming into his own as well as a modern horror director. I loved Barbarian and Weapons. Both fantastic movies.
Yeah, fantastic. And the thing with both of these films is both while watching those movies and when comparing them to each other, you come in and your expectation is constantly shifting, right? So Barbarian was really taking place during this, I think in the early, 2020s, there's a real renaissance of extreme horror. It's kind of the most mainstream that really extreme violence had been in a very long time. And Barbarian has some really jarring violence and other things going on in it that I did not expect to see at that time from such a popular film. And again, the film keeps changing as you watch it. Weapons does the same thing, maybe even more so. Every moment you're watching it, you're getting little pieces of what's going on, and your understanding of the situation is changing. I actually heard a really funny criticism of Weapons. I told a friend to see it, and she watched it, and I thought she'd really like it. And it was a coworker, so not like a close friend or anything. It was a coworker. And then she said, I felt like at the end, well, she said at first I liked it because I thought it was all about trauma and the problems that kids endure, which I don't know. And then she said, but then I realized it was just a straightforward witch story, and I really don't like that. It's very offensive to witches. And I was like, okay.
Brian, I have to say this. That is the most Portland thing I've ever heard.
She's not like a Portland native. She's like older Gen X, like New Yorker, actually. But she's extremely Gen X-y.
That is genuinely really funny. I was not expecting, just like with Weapons of Barbarian, I was not expecting that dramatic turn
I know.
there.
And what do I even say? Because you don't want to be like, this is, my friend, and I don't want to be like, just be like, well, that's a fucking stupid take. Why didn't you just watch the movie?
Oh, that is fucking awesome. That's hilarious. But no, yeah, like, as we were mentioning earlier, like, we do like quote-unquote elevated art horror, right? But it can also exist alongside quote-unquote like regular horror, even though, of course, we don't accept that framing necessarily. But
well, yeah, I would say that it is all horror, and it is all on a spectrum, and there's levels to it. You can appreciate Midsummer as this beautiful, like, kind of like psychodrama about rebirth and kind of like culture clash. You can also see it as like a classic gothic horror about a cult,
No, exactly. It is on the same level. And, some people have even said it's kind of like a soft remake of The Wicker Man. There's a lot of similarities with The Wicker Man and Midsummer. Obviously.
It's so much better than The Wicker. And I like The Wicker Man. I think it's better than The Wicker Man. Straight up.
Wow, Brian. You know what? I'm glad you're not here because I would fight. No, I'm just kidding. But
I just think The Wicker Man, which is a great movie, it's just like it's so Christian, man. And it's like, all right, whatever.
Yeah, I can see that. But I mean, isn't it also like, and to be fair, I haven't seen The Wicker Man in a while. That was like one of my favorite like classic horror movies when I was like a teenager.
Well, it's amazing.
But like my whole thing is like, is it really Christian or is it more criticizing Christianity? Because I think there's a lot of criticism.
I can't speak for the film, but the book was written by like a right-wing Christian, like a British Christian, like kind of conservative.
Okay, then there may be some.
I feel
may be some credence to that.
The movie has, it's the time the movie was made, and of course there's different views coming in. The movie kind of works in a little bit more ambiguity. The book does not. The book is a book about evil pagans.
Damn, Brian, you better not tell your coworker to watch The Wicker Man.
Okay, but she loves Hocus Pocus. Which, like, how is that different from Weapons?
Oh, okay, fair enough. I thought you were going to be like, how lame is that?
No, it's a good family film. I'm just saying, how is the portrayal of witches in that better than in Weapons?
That's true, yeah. Because, I mean, what was her name? Dolores in Weapons? I can't remember that character's name. Or Gladys. When she first appeared on the screen, I was like, holy shit, evil Chapel Roan's here. Well, maybe more evil, depending on the revelation.
I remember thinking, like, oh, did they do this as, like, an old lady trying to look like Chapel Roan? Because that's so what it looks like.
Yeah, really fucking funny. And also, talking about Weapons, because I know that's the most recent movie I've seen in theaters, but like that principal, he really needs to fucking lay off the hot dogs, all right? He's gonna have to go to the doctor and talk to that long-haired doctor who's since passed away. Once again, rest in peace, Trevor Moore. But no, yeah, Zach Kreger is definitely a recent alumni, in my opinion, of the quote-unquote elevated horror pantheon. And to be fair, he is also a student of Jordan Peele. He said that himself. So, we're not saying he ripped off Jordan Peele, to be very clear, but he's definitely a student and a friend, a good friend of Jordan Peele, also talk about the thing about elevated horror, right? Is that a lot of elevated horror filmmakers, or at least some of the more prominent ones I can think of, started their careers in comedy or sketch comedy or stand-up comedy or something along those lines.
And I think
which we talked about in our chat at some point, right?
Yeah, privately.
But like this dichotomy between horror and comedy, but there's actually a lot in common with comedy and horror that would make somebody who is a comedy creator good at horror.
Yeah, because you're picking up on a set of emotions that run through, I think, both comedy and horror. So the sense of unease, right? A lot of humor comes from that. That's what cringe comedy is, ultimately, right? It's the sense of, like, growing, gnawing discomfort. Even just, like, the comedy of the grotesque. It comes from this sense of shock of, like, witnessing something that your brain isn't used to seeing or can't process. You see that a lot in WKUK and a lot in things like Mr. Show. Maybe less in the case of, like, something like Key and Peele, which is more character driven. But yeah, I think that the reason you're seeing these specific types of comedy writers, comedy actors move to horror really effectively, because you don't see that with every type of comedy writer. You don't necessarily see like a sitcom writer pivot to horror. You don't necessarily see a stand-up comedian do that, although I'm sure some of them could. In both of these cases, what you're seeing are people who come from like specifically sketch comedy in like a post SNL time frame, which is very about strange characters. It's kind of about this balance of like borderline gross out humor and like kind of characters who put you ill at ease. It doesn't take a whole lot of tweaking to, you know, kind of pluck out all those elements and drop them into a horror context, right? I don't think.
No, I 100% agree. And in fact, there are some Key and Peele and Whitest Kids You Know sketches that are like actual like horrifying premises in a lot of ways. Like especially some of the more body horror sketches of those shows. Like,
yeah.
Obviously, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are definitely some horrifying premises from both of those shows where I'm like, oh my God, that could actually be like a real life fucking horror movie. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, Whitest Kids You Know was a much lower budget show than Key and Peele, but still, they made a lot of content for how much money they were given, which I assume was probably a couple $100 per episode, to be honest with you, on some of those fucking sketches.
A truly innovative show. You know, not a dire time necessarily for sketch comedy, not like it is right now, but kind of a time when there wasn't a lot of youth. I think WKUK starts just after Mr. Show ends, right? And you want to talk about a show with some body horror elements and some kind of unnerving surrealism. I think you see a lot of the same elements, at least in like the type of horror that our subjects trade in. You'll see a lot in like 90s and 2000s comedy in general. I think there's a lot of shared characteristics there. Whereas maybe with someone like Ari Aster, you don't really see it the same way. He's going, I think, more for like, or he's coming from a more impressionistic place, is the best way I can put it.
Oh, yeah, especially Ari Aster, for fucking sure. And, you know, you talked about Mr. Show, right? And obviously, you know, Bob Odenkirk and David Cross haven't made something that's, like, explicitly horror. But, you know, talk about some, you know, horrifying portrayals in dramatic roles. I mean, both Bob Odenkirk and David Cross have certainly done that, especially Bob Odenkirk as of recent. Like, to a certain extent, like, the Nobody films have been horrifying in their fucking world building. Did you see Nobody, the first one?
They absolutely are. Yeah, that absolutely works as a type of horror film. The way that it like crosses boundaries and it kind of makes you reassess the rules of what's happening. I would definitely say there's something horrifying about that. Kind of a sister to elevated horror that is almost kind of like an elevated action film, right? It's got all these traditional action tropes, but it's like kind of incorporating some more sophisticated storytelling methods and some more sophisticated, or at least the appearance of more sophistication in its like cinematography. And I think that's what you really see at the core, though, is like there is sort of a hunger for, you know, we always talk about middle brow content being like our favorite, right? But where is that more true than in like kind of like elevated genre films? It's literally there in the name, where it's kind of trying to reconcile the traditional, you know, genre filmmaking, genre cinema with techniques and storytelling and ethos and just a level of gravitas that comes more from like an art house cinema thing.
Yes, and you know, we have covered on the show previously in singular film reviews. But, you know, I made this comment kind of snidely, but we've reviewed things like that I would call elevated hot couch, like Equilibrium and stuff like that, and Law Abiding Citizen to a certain extent. Like, and of course, hot couch guy movies are always lowbrow. But like the idea that there is also a film genre that's trying to elevate itself among like the lowest brow content and it still is lowbrow, like that shit's really fucking funny to me. Like,
well, the truth is, and I don't like this movie. The elevated hot couch guy movie, Taylor, is Boondock Saints.
Yes, that is 100% true. A movie that is trying to, like, as crudely as possible, show, like, pastiches of, like, actually critically acclaimed filmmakers through the lens of, like, the dumbest guy you knew in high school. Like, that is that fucking movie to a T.
And I think I want to, before I really get into my feelings about the phrase and a lot of attempts at the genre, love Jordan Peele, love Robert Eggers, like Ari Aster. You know, I like the Babadook. But I think overall, elevated horror, quote, as a trend, as a critical phrase, I think it's, like you said, Taylor, it's very reductive. And I think it's just kind of bad. I think it's kind of just bad for horror, and it's kind of bad for cinema, because I've always been sensitive, because like you, Taylor, horror is my favorite genre. I've always been sensitive to this idea that there is a higher type of horror movie. That's why I don't love The Exorcist the way that a lot of people do. I love The Exorcist 3. We've talked about it in a previous episode. I enjoyed the William Peter Blatty book, The Exorcist. I think the first movie's very good. I love The Shining, but I hate when people talk about it. I hate when people talk about The Exorcist. I hate listening to people talk about Rosemary's Baby because there's a type of person who doesn't like horror for the most part. And they see one horror movie that's really good, and maybe that's The Exorcist. Maybe that's The Shining. And they go, oh, horror is kind of stupid. It's not really scary, but that's not like a horror movie. That's like a really good movie. And it's kind of like, well, first of all, you don't watch any horror movies, so you don't know. Second of all, like, it's operating on the same levels as most horror movies. And I think there is a type of movie that is self-consciously trying to be elevated. I really don't like it. And I want to talk a little bit, Taylor. Have you seen the movie Skinamarink?
Yes, that is a movie that I do know that people have, talked about in regards to elevating the genre of horror in a way. And I watched it for about 5 minutes, and we're going to be honest, I was like, I don't want to fucking watch this dog shit, because I know exactly how it's going to be. And to be fair, I'm sure in a certain context with like big screens and sound systems, and if you're in the right headspace for it, I'm sure it could be amazing. But I'm going to be honest, even in that context, I would be like, this is just not engaging for me at all. I'm just going to be real here.
Right. So there is a type of millennial who really responded to Skinamarink, and I understand why. To me, Skinamarink is everything bad about the, quote, elevated horror trend. Skinamarink, to me, and people can call this reductive, I know there are people who really like that movie, I know it speaks to people, is kind of like, you see the YouTube trend, the online trend of analog horror, some of which is kind of fun, some of which is interesting, a lot of which is kind of dog shit, but it plays off of millennial and older Gen Z kind of nostalgia and a sense of childhood being gone. That's kind of what you're thinking of. That's why all this liminal space shit and all of this like VHS horror can be really resonant, and you can do really interesting things. Skinamarink is kind of like trying to do analog horror for the big screen. That's what I think, and I think it fundamentally does not work. I think the thing that makes some of the analog horror stuff, some of the ARG stuff or whatever, kind of fun, you're usually seeing it online. You're seeing it in the context of like YouTube and social media, and it's a descendant to the creepypasta thing, the sending it to your friends. That's kind of part of the experience. Skinamarink, though, is kind of like it's made to look like an analog horror thing, and it's kind of like putting you back in the space of like, if you're a millennial or an older, Gen Z, of like, oh, remember when you were a little child, and it's like in like the mid 90s or the late 90s or whatever. And I think it sucks. I think it's very self-consciously made to look artsy. It's very minimal. Doesn't have a whole lot to say with it. But there's a lot of people that love it because it hits all those marks. For them, it hits the personal nostalgia, but also it does hit all the trappings of what elevated horror is. That is to say, it's not graphic, which actually there is a lot of what we'd call elevated horror that's fairly graphic. We've touched on that. But most people's perception of elevated horror, right, is that it's not graphic, it's not real violent, and it's more psychological. That to me is like what Skinamarink is. It's like a student film idea that's stretched out way too long. But it has this aesthetic of like higher art. It's like, it's not a normal horror movie. It's kind of like in your head, and it's really minimal, and it's really slow burn. And I really don't think that it's like that for any other reason than to kind of look like a higher art type of horror film. I really think it is elevation for its own sake. And I think there's a pattern of movies like that. That's my least favorite one. That's Skinamarink, which again, I think is taking this kind of fun analog horror thing that comes online and trying to go like, I'm going to make this into serious art. And I think it sucks. The film Men, did you see Men?
I did not, but I do know that your legendary hatred of men is something I do think about. And obviously not the concept of men, because we know, Brian, you're extremely gay. But I mean, the movie,
yeah,
Men,
I love Men.
100%. I even saw like trailers for this, and I'm like, this looks terrible. I'm going to be honest.
I was excited to see it just because I didn't know what it was. And, I thought this might be some kind of bad elevated horror bullshit, but it might be really good. Men is absolutely a movie that has kind of the setup and the staging of like elevation, but it has nothing to say. It kind of starts with something and then it kind of loses sight of it, and it does not come together. But because it feels serious and it feels artistic and it feels important, it's just hoping that's enough for you. There's sort of an aesthetic now, an elevated horror aesthetic, and I think some filmmakers, they feel like it's just enough to have that aesthetic. And if that's the case, if that's what we're doing now, I would much rather just watch something that is art, that is, artistically worthwhile, that is interesting and challenging, but something that is just more like Nightmare on Elm Street or Evil Dead, that is not trying to be subtle, that is not trying to be profound, and is just being a fun, well-made horror movie. If we're doing this thing where we're almost hitting these class signifiers of this is artsy horror now, is, I think, really damaging to, this might be dramatic to horror as a genre, and it's bringing a lot of fucking people in that don't like horror, that are gonna stroke their fucking beards, and they're gonna go, I don't really like horror, but I actually like this. It almost reflects the thing we've talked about with, for instance, nu metal. Do you know how we always say, people always go, oh, nu metal sucks, but this one nu metal band that I like, that's actually not nu metal. Talk about Deftones or System of a Down or whatever. I feel like you get a similar thing with the elevated horror thing. I don't really like horror, but the Babadook is so smart, and it really helped me confront my trauma. I don't really like horror, but, Hereditary, it really is more about, the shared trauma and the mental illness of this family. And it's shut the fuck up. And I like both those movies, but it's kind of it's not that subtle of a movie. You're not a genius for figuring that out, And I think with the popularity and the success of these better, quote-unquote, elevated horror films, you're now seeing what to me is basically slop. Worse than that, it's an elitist slop.
Yes, and talk about once again how snooty, once again talk about class signifier type people when it comes to horror and other genres, obviously, that they would call elevated, right? But we were talking earlier about the slasher boom of the 80s or whatever, that basically every elevated horror elitist fucking hates and they think is dog shit and not really.
And they've never watched them. They've never seen any of them.
No, they haven't. But and also especially Nightmare on Elm Street, but I would even argue a lot of the Friday the 13th movies, there is so much psychological and psychosexual elements to those movies that are extremely interesting to analyze, especially Nightmare on Elm Street. The idea of a murderer, well, to be fair, obviously in the remake they retconned him as being a pedophile, which they never alluded. I think they heavily alluded to that.
They allude to it, but you can take it or leave it.
He was a child murderer. And then, of course, he's haunting these teenagers' dreams and killing them in their sleep, right? But the idea of this collective trauma of this community, that they took out this bad guy that the authorities didn't want to or couldn't. I mean, they couldn't because there was some legal mumbo jumbo. I mean, it's explained in the movie, but obviously that's stupid in real life, but whatever, right? And they took it upon themselves to end this horror themselves. But in the end, they kind of perpetuated that future horror onto their future generations, which is an interesting thematic theme to think about.
Yeah.
But these elevated horror people don't even want to think about that. They're like, oh, he's stupid, and he says
he's got a burnt
things
face
in the latter half of the movies, and he's got a pizza face, and people who like it are fucking stupid.
And which of these movies? So another theme. So we've talked before about Nightmare on Elm Street. Those are some of both of our favorite movies ever. Those are also movies about how parents, because they feel they know best, they shield their children from knowledge and experience. That's what Wes Craven always said, is that if he had to explain Nightmare on Elm Street in one sentence, he would say it's a movie where parents are trying to stop their children from dreaming, which is a little bit of a hokey, silly thing to say. There's some real thought put towards those concepts in there. Talking about Friday the 13th, the first 3 Friday the 13th movies, not the first one, not the first 2, the first 3 films in that series are all staged like fucking Hitchcock films. They're so about tension building and building and building and release, and there is gore and there's salacious bits, but there's a real craftsmanship to them. And if you are kind of putting most horror in this ghetto so that you can say that the most obviously artistically viable horror films are the good ones, then you're not watching any of these movies. And again, and we said it at the top of the show, there's always been movies that you could call elevated horror because it's a nonsense phrase, but Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Stepford Wives, Rosemary's Baby, you can go all the way back to Cat People. If elevated horror is some new thing, then what is Caligari? What is Nosferatu? These are, you know what I mean? They're working within a tradition in horror films. When you look at them that way, that's why I like them. I don't watch a film by Eggers and go, oh, this is so much deeper than every other film I've seen. Smarter and deeper than a lot of films. But what I'm seeing is a continuation of these themes and an appreciation for them. I think the critical response to horror for a long time has just been, this is bad, this isn't real film. Probably until the 2000s, maybe even the 2010s, right? It was almost like a joke amongst horror fans that critics don't understand horror, they don't like it, and they kind of look down on the genre, and they also look down on us as fans of the genre. And I know sometimes when you say that, someone who's not into horror as a genre, they think like, that's not true. You're being a little dramatic. That is true. I think we all got picked on by nosy teachers when we were kids because we had a horror comic or a horror t-shirt or something. I think anyone that's really into that genre has had that experience.
No, absolutely. And, talk about once again another movie that nobody would call quote unquote elevated horror or a horror movie with like, dramatic themes into it and things you could actually read into it is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's so much psychology and psychosexual like remora in that movie. People still analyze that movie to this day. It came out fucking 50 plus years ago.
And again, lots of shades of like classic Hitchcock in there. It's not just some standard like blood and guts movie. It's actually like very restrained. It's very about like kind of building tension and surreality and the sense that Sally is kind of gradually descending into another world in her encounter with the family, right? What is not elevated about that? That it's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What is significantly more profound about like the beheading scene in Hereditary?
And that's also a really good one. And obviously people, as we said earlier, Ari Aster and Robert Eggers are like at least the top two people when people think of elevated horror. But like at the same time, like that scene where you're building up to the like girl who gets her head fucking cut off and something horrible is going to happen to her. You just know it from like the first moment you see her on screen. And you're just like, what is this building up to? What is this building up to? And then when it finally happens, like when that first happened, my jaw literally dropped.
It's so awful.
It was so awful, and it was just like, and to be fair, obviously, like, the vast majority of us will never experience a sibling, family member, someone we know get violently beheaded, even in an accident, right? But, like, we've all been there, right? Where, like, we just have been in an incident where, like, we just know something awful is going to happen, and something, like, the shoe drops in some way, and it, like, leaves an imprint on you for the rest of your fucking life. And that is what that scene obviously is. And, like, especially if you were the one that didn't end up, like, maimed, or didn't end up as maimed as that person, or even doesn't have to be, like, injury. It could be like a psychological trauma or something, but you're just going to have to be like, how do I explain this to the people in my life?
And
we've all
failed
had
in
that.
a responsibility that you were given, and something
we've
bad
all fucking had that. And we've all had that.
That's getting back to, I think, the thing that what we're calling elevated horror at its best does well, right? Is it kind of gets back to a more primal sort of horror movie. Like Aster and Eggers especially, their films remind me of nothing so much as like 1930s and 1940s horror, like pre-code horror. That's kind of very moody and very like atmospheric and kind of otherworldly feeling and sort of like gothic. Things that kind of tap into like this sense of foreboding and this sense of like displacement that we all experience but can't really articulate. I think Midsummer does that very well.
Yes, it 100% does that very well. And, obviously we've talked shit on the people who, of course, say elevated horror and dismiss horror. But, like, once again, we want to be clear. We do like, quote-unquote, elevated horror. We just like horror in general. If it's a good movie that explores themes that we find interesting and, in a lot of cases, are even scary or cosmically horrifying, we like this shit. We're not saying the genre sucks, to be very clear. We like a lot of these fucking movies.
It's about the discourse around it, and I think the marketing around it. For me, it's a lot of the marketing around it that I find distasteful. The reason I talk shit about Skinamarink isn't because I think you shouldn't like it. I don't care if you like it. I don't think it doesn't deserve the title of elevated horror. Certainly that's that. It's that I feel like that film, it benefited from some marketing, from elevated horror marketing, in my opinion. Jordan Peele certainly gets mentioned and discussed as elevated horror, and you might notice I haven't really said anything about Jordan Peele this episode, and I love Jordan Peele. He's, of the four directors you named, Taylor, he's by far my favorite, because when people call Jordan Peele elevated horror, straight up don't know what they mean. To me, that's so traditional Rod Serling, Outer Limits, Tales from the Crypt type horror that I can't conceive of it as being like an art house horror. And I see that. I've read that in articles. I've seen lots of people refer to him that way. I think like that has to be a marketing thing to me, to call Jordan Peele elevated horror when he's so firmly in the tradition of science fiction and so firmly in the tradition of the B movie. And that's a lot of my issues with the elevated horror thing. I think it caters to sort of, to an artistic elitism. But also I think a lot of the distinctions are kind of fake, right? Like there's almost nothing in common between Ari Aster and Robert Eggers, except for in the general sense, they both make horror movies that are kind of very psychological and very nuanced and slow burn. But as far as actual technical similarities or similarities in content, they're completely different.
Yes, and you talked about Jordan Peele, of course, and that Twilight Zone sort of lane, but like he literally narrated the reboot of the Twilight Zone that came out a few fucking years ago for that exact reason, because he had that
It was
artistic
okay.
similarity.
Real quick, because I love Jordan Peele and I love talking about him. I would say it's like any anthology horror show. There's good episodes and there's bad episodes. I would say that I thought there were going to be more good episodes than there were.
Well, to be fair, at least it wasn't as much of a disaster as the Twilight Zone movie, if you know what I mean.
A real elevated horror movie is so elevated that it elevated three people to. Never mind.
It did elevate those children to heaven, unfortunately, and also
Yeah, exactly.
Vic Morrow. Rest in peace, Vic Morrow, and those two children
Yeah.
whose names I can't remember at
Yeah.
the moment, but definitely rest in
But
peace.
you know,
to those
you
two.
died for a worthy cause, which is the worst segment in the Twilight Zone movie that nobody remembers.
And also, John Landis's like shithead kid gets to have a career too on top of it, or did get to have a career. So that was
Yeah.
the ultimate sacrifice those three people
But
made.
my favorite elevated horror film is fucking cop movie he made. That's some great elevated horror.
True. In fact, believe it or not, a guy who worked extensively on the Hillary Clinton campaign was the orc cop in that movie. No, I'm kidding, but he didn't
That's
look like
amazing.
that orc.
Is that true?
Yeah, I'm just kidding. No, he just looked like him.
Okay. I was like, that would be so incredible because that is such a lib-coded movie to me.
You thought it was gonna be like, who is like Trump's Treasury Secretary? Fuck, who is that guy? Oh my God, it's gonna fucking drive me crazy, but he produced fucking Suicide Squad.
Oh man, that does make sense though. That's a very like shyster friendly movie.
Yes, and also his wife made Me You Madness, if you remember that movie from a few years ago.
No, I don't know what that is. That sounds awful.
It was basically a like, you know how like there's like power fantasy type stuff, but it's like women's power fantasy.
Oh, based. Good for sisters are doing it for themselves.
We believe in girl power on this podcast. We really fucking do.
Oh, I thought maybe it was an R revenge movie, but it's not.
No. As far as I'm aware of, I don't fucking think so. Steve Mnuchin, that was it. He was the guy who was Trump's Treasury Secretary, and he produced like Suicide Squad.
A true visionary in many ways.
No, absolutely 100%. But speaking of true visionary creators, Brian, we have been recording for about an hour. Do we have any final thoughts or any final subjects you want to go before we get to our pluggables?
Yeah, stop calling things elevated horror, like in my opinion. I think if you want to say that a specific movie has more artistic themes or got some compelling psychological subtext or something, that's cool. I think that's fine. I think this whole idea of like a subgenre of horror that's elevated is like what's the implication of that? That the rest of it can't be elevated, right? And you're calling it elevated, speaking, to like critics now and people who say that they really like elevated horror as opposed to other horror. You're recognizing the most obvious like signifiers of artiness and kind of pretense in them. I would say if you're going to look for horror films that are deeper, that have, more going on, maybe they have more subtext, maybe just you should try to watch any horror film that way instead of creating this distinction in your head between the elevated ones and the schlock or whatever. Because the truth is, and this is, we say it as a joke, but we always talk about the middlebrow culture revolution. The truth is, like, making art can be really messy, and all of these things bleed into each other, right? That's why you have some gore and some sleaze and some trash in your elevated horror. And that's also why someone like Tobe Hooper can make Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and he is just trying to make a good, scary movie. But what sort of the radiation that's thrown off of him making that horror movie is this kind of tension and this psychology. That's why Sam Raimi can make Evil Dead, which again is actually just straight up supposed to be a fun popcorn movie about killing monsters, but it's got all this surreal kind of disorienting things and all of these kind of unpredictable twists and turns that really are unusual in other horror films. So the idea that for something to be artistically viable, it has to check off all of these specific boxes. It's really limiting to the genre, and you're really limiting yourself as a viewer of the genre, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't fucking agree more. Like, to every part of that. Like, stop calling things
Well, thank
elevated.
you.
Like, there is artistic merit to literally so many different things that people, like, dismiss. And, we've made fun of things that have tried to be, quote-unquote, elevated, like I said earlier, with the elevated hot couch
Yeah.
and stuff like that, right? But, like, even in those, like, dog shit movies, there are interesting elements to talk about in the way that, like, we think of, like, dumb people trying to analyze the world as they see fit. Like, there's something interesting to be said for that. And, like, it's one of those things where people are like, modern art isn't real art or this blah, blah, blah. But trying to quantify something as real or not real art, I think is a very like faulty premise and idea to go after. And it's one of those things where just try to have a little bit more humility of what you think is valuable and what isn't. Like, to be fair, it's not saying that you can't think things suck, but to say they're not art or that they don't have artistic merit is honestly, and I'm not saying this in a way like people don't jump on me for that, but trying to say that like things that you consider lowbrow or middlebrow or whatever to not be real art and made for simpletons is honestly kind of borderline fascist thinking, if I'm being honest with you. I think there's some elements.
Well, yeah, it's the degenerate art thing. The other thing is like if you're watching any sort of movie on a streaming service on your TV, maybe if I wanted to be the biggest asshole I possibly could, if you are watching any sort of film, whether it's high art or low art or it's absolute total exploitation, like Amazon or Netflix or some other evil streaming service, maybe we should drop any pretense that this content is being watched by us in service of art in this moment.
Yes, especially that new dog shit War of the Worlds movie with Ice Cube that I know we talked about pretty recently. I think
that was good. I like that. Before.
I especially loved the scene where the climax is Amazon Air saves the world.
So that's my favorite elevated horror movie. I'm going to start calling everything elevated horror.
Ice Cube's portrayal when he sees his son die is very elevated horror. It shows how much of a psychopath he is. Well, Brian, we were talking about Bob Odenkirk and how a lot of the things he does are like borderline horror and like, elevated action stuff. But also, Brian, David Cross, once again, the other half of Mr. Show, he was in Chipmunks 3, which is definitely elevated horror, if you think about it. Like, it's talking monsters who torture him the entire movie.
Yeah.
Oh, God. But yes, that is our episode on elevated/art horror for this week. So let's get into our pluggables without further ado. So you can follow me at Carlos Shantor on twitter.com. And as well, please follow us and subscribe to us on both of our YouTube and our Spotify channels where we're uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, our good friends Scott, Sean, Robert are creating a fantastic series. Last time I checked, I believe they're about a quarter to a third of the way through their funding goal, but they need, both our moral and financial support to continue to get their series off the ground. Last time we, caught up with them, they were in pre-production and they have a shooting schedule ready for the series to continue. Have there been any updates since our last recording, Brian, that you're aware of?
I haven't talked to Scott in about a week. They are doing casting calls. They're looking for people now. So I'm going to check in with Scott soon and see how everything's going. But he seemed real excited and he seemed pretty positive last I spoke to him.
All right, fucking awesome. Absolutely. So, but yeah, like I said, definitely donate to the campaign. And, as always, with our promise to you is that if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email telling us and showing us that you donated, and we will, within good reason, about $25 match those donations. Because, of course, we want Scott, Sean, Robert's dreams to become a reality. And speaking of people whose dreams we want to become a reality, of course, we've been plugging since it pretty much fucking happened. But, Luigi Mangione, the UHC main suspect in the killing of the UHC CEO, he's being brought to trial, I would guess, fairly soon. They're, quote unquote, still gathering evidence. But of course, us on the show,
there's no evidence to gather.
Exactly. No shit posting. We're not being contrarian. There's just objectively no good evidence against him. He's completely innocent of all charges. They are trying to implicate a innocent man. Legally speaking, an innocent man. Last time I checked, They did not Mirandize him during his Pennsylvania arrest, which basically makes almost all the quote-unquote physical evidence they have against him basically not valid for the first, 20 minutes of his arrest or something.
If they had some damning evidence against him, they would make sure we all knew about it. We say it every week, but I'm sorry. It's true. There's just nothing. There's nothing here. They're making an example of him because they're mad at the solidarity that the masses of people are showing for him.
Absolutely. People have solidarity for him. Everybody from the left to the right wing, although the right wing have solidarity in the way that right wingers do, which is completely antisocial, but that's neither here nor there. But needless to say, everybody has solidarity with Luigi except the literal richest among us. So we need to keep that solidarity up. We need to, spread the good word. If you don't have money to give to the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund, totally understand. Our economy is definitely going to take a shit pretty goddamn soon if we're going to be real here. So if you don't have the money to donate to it, totally fine. Both Brian and I have donated, but send him a letter, talk about him on the internet. Just don't engage in the negative zeitgeist that may or may not exist for him at this point. A lot of the AstroTurf negative conversations around Luigi, but yeah, just do as much as you can. Even if you have nothing nice to say, just don't say it at all. I guess if that's the best you could do, because we don't need more negativity around this case. We really don't.
Well, I think the thing to really drive home, if you don't know about these facts, if you don't feel comfortable donating, if you don't feel like maybe it's you aren't convinced of his innocence. The one thing I would like you to keep in your mind is that, as far as we know right now, there is no evidence. Like, if you still think he did it, you can think that personally, but do you want the courts, do you want the police, do you want the feds to be able to pluck you out of a McDonald's and say, you look like this guy and we don't have anything on you, but boy, we want to put you on death row. Boy, we want to fucking execute you. Because that's what this is about, really.
Yeah, 100%. It's basically another piece in Trump's puzzle, and obviously in previous administrations previously, but, Trump is obviously expediting this process, as Republicans tend to do. As Democrats love to start a process, then Republicans love expediting it. But at the same time, it's the casual erosion of due process in this country. And you engaging in this idea that this, once again, innocent man, due to spurious at best allegations and evidence against him, is going to have the fucking book thrown out, including the death penalty, once again, to be very clear, is ludicrous that you would engage in that level of the premise that the government is trying to throw at him right now. It's just ridiculous nonsense.
Yeah, this is literally just a guy. This isn't a celebrity. This isn't a politician. This isn't someone rich and powerful. This is just a guy that they plucked out of a McDonald's. If they're doing that to him, they literally could just pick any of us out of any fucking restaurant, any hotel that we're hanging out in, fucking video arcade. I don't know where the fuck you hang out. And they go, oh, we think you did this thing. Time to execute you.
Yes, no, exactly. We just have to be there for each other, 100%. Even if we're being accused of some awful things by the government, are you going to tell me that the government's never lied or got something wrong?
Even if you don't, it's malicious and you're like, I think that's a conspiracy theory. Even if they're wrong, that they're mistaken. Because again, if they had the evidence, I am confident we would all know about it.
No, abso-fucking-lutely. So, but yeah, as we've been plugging for a while, the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund, and, it's one of those things where, just like with the Lucifer And The Father campaign, if you donate to the campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, just show us any proof that you donated, and we will, within good reason, about $20-25 match those donations as well, because we want, once again, Luigi to have the best possible criminal trial he can. He's already in a pretty good position for somebody who's facing the barrel of the federal fucking government, as well as 2 state governments on top of it. So he's doing about as good as you can possibly get, but we really do need to help him out as much as we fucking can. And speaking of people who we need to help out as much as you possibly can, folks, please become a patron of ours today. We have a Patreon. We, of course, aren't going to lock any content. We've been saying that for a while, and we have not changed our minds on that. But we'll give perks to people who want to donate to our podcast, because we are essentially giving you a product for free. We take time out of our day, and of course, it's always fun. We get to talk about the shit we want to talk about, but we're still taking time out of our day to make good quality content for you. So if you'd like to donate, you'd want to become a patron of ours, please become a patron. The tier that we've been plugging the most, of course, recently is the $5 tier, which is where you get every episode of the show 48 hours early. That's guaranteed 2 to 4 episodes a month. So about $1.25 to $2.50 per episode. And honestly, it's a great deal. As Brian always says, when you're at work and you're at the water cooler at your cuck office job that everybody fucking wants to work at nowadays, that every Gen Xer said was lame, sellout bullshit, but you want to be there and hear all the good Brian and Taylor takes way before anybody else, because you want to be at the lead of the cultural zeitgeist that is Mao, right?
You will get so much receptionist sniz if you just parrot our takes at the water cooler. I promise you that. Tell Carolyn Accounting about how there's no such thing as elevated horror. Horror is just a classic, broad genre, and there are multiple themes across the spectrum that can be high and low simultaneously. And watch the panties drop. They love that shit.
No, absolutely. And to all the millennials at home, at your office job, you could get a Pam of your own if you do this. This is the ultimate Pam Riz.
You could get a Pam for your work from home office job.
Yeah! Yeah, that's so fucking funny. Oh, God. And then, Brian, do you have any pluggables as well?
As always, please follow the show at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads, and follow us at the Facebook page Millennials Are Old. Again, the most effective way to reach us for the show, if you want to yell at us, if you want to geek us, if you want to suggest something, if you got something you want to show us, is at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram. You can also follow me personally at JLo Biafra. That's all one word, JLo Biafra, on Instagram or Threads as well. Threads is always going to be the optimal place to reach me, whether it's for the show or just because you want to, send me death threats. I'll see it right away on my phone. I will probably block you if I don't recognize you, because I assume that everyone is a Russian bot out to get my information. But if you slip through the cracks and you have some feedback for the show, yeah, message Millennials Are Old Pod on Threads.
Absolutely, yes. Please follow us on all our social medias. And maybe if you're really good, we will follow your dick pic posting account. We actually probably won't do that. But maybe if you're really nice,
But
we'll do
maybe,
that.
yeah, maybe if you're like a cool guy, you're real chill about it.
Speaking of things I'm very chill about, Brian, I think that ends our episode here. And speaking of things that I really want to chill out to, I think I want to go to sleep and not be horrified by the world. And I need to be propped up or elevated in my sleeping position because I have a really bad back end and it'll help me sleep a little bit better.
That's an old millennial problem for sure.
100%. An elderly millennial problem because we are, at this point, the oldest generation by far.
A dying millennial problem.
100%. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight and don't be scared by trauma as monsters or whatever other fucking trope that exists in horror these days. Just don't.
Just watch a slam movie. Watch a movie with a giant monster. Watch something with a kaiju. Unwind a little bit. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, stop being so serious. That's what we always say to these elevated horror. Exactly. We say, why so serious? You all laugh at me because you think I'm crazy. I laugh at you because you're all the same. All right, so have a good night, everybody.